inspired by poetry.
Let's give it some lip.
Da-da.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone, to another podcast on Life Inspired by Poetry. And we are so fortunate this week. We are joined by Dr. Marcus Bussey, who is going to talk about his poetry, his poetic process, his poetic inspiration, and just why he feels poetry is an essential aspect of life. But I'm also joined by TB.
I'm glad to be here. And Marcus, you're laughing a bit at my singing.
I was thrilled
good,
to have some a cappella. I just think that's so cool.
Go hand in hand, don't they?
No. So, well, thank you. Thank you for, I should be close to this, I guess. Thank you for inviting me along and giving me a chance just to reflect on why I write and why I read poetry. Because to me, it's an essential part of my process.
It's excellent.
It's part of also my sense making in a way of bringing lightness into a world that can often be dark. I'm not good at writing tragic poetry, though I have obviously done so at different times when I've been feeling tragic, which we all do.
Yes, we do.
But I tend to look for some kind of lightness. But for me, poetry is also deeply intertwined with my thinking and feeling and again, process about theorising reality, my way of reading the world.
Yeah, it's philosophical, isn't it? It's like that it raises your consciousness about the things around you.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And that word consciousness is really key for me, is that who am I? Obviously we are language beings, but we're much more. Language has its sort of lovely penumbral sort of fuzziness around it, where I can say ice cream and you might think of chocolate chip and you might think of vanilla and I might think of spearmint. There are all these kind of shadowy elements to our use of words.
That's right. And language, that connotation that's attached to it, that kind of, it's constructed. We've given symbols to represent sounds, to represent ideas, to represent forms, to represent then some sort of transcendent thought or philosophical idea.
Absolutely.
But really the philosophical idea comes first.
Yes.
And then we use the language as a way to try to navigate it.
But then language releases and nuances that philosophical idea. It's like they grow in tandem. There's this a dialogue even within our own relationship with our own writing.
That's right.
It's incredibly dialogical.
I find out what I know and what I learn by writing a lot of times because it's in the writing, in the act of writing, that I key into, like you say, a certain word that's like, it just opens up to, that's what it is. It's this, it's not this, it's this.
And it's quite contextual, isn't it? It's our lived experiences are all buried in the how we see the words. I was talking to a colleague recently about dream, and she said, do you dream? And I took it literally. Do I go to bed at night and do I have thoughts in my head and do I dream? And I said, of course you do. Of course I do. Every night I go and I dream. And I was thinking, I was just like, trauma dumping is what my dreams really are.
Okay.
But she was talking about dream and this idea of something bigger or greater that one can aspire to. And I realized how nuanced it is, right? And how contextual it is. Like, so my dreams help me with my stress, right? I release it into my thoughts in the night and I wake up the next morning renewed. But she was talking about something much bigger, and that's what I think the beauty of these words are. It's how they mean something very different to all of us. So
for me, I relate to obviously both kinds of dreaming, but dreaming that is in a sense a voice for yearning, for that longing that we all have for a world that is maybe more joyful or more just or
better,
better in whatever way. And that, to me, that yearning is what really motivates a lot of my poetry, actually. There's this yearning for something. That's
for the next big thing.
Well, yes, that's right.
The title of your book of poetry.
That's right. It's yearning for that.
And
because I lecture at uni here and I do my history stuff and my futures stuff, I see very much that yearning's at the heart of culture. actually, that it is why people have built pyramids at different times or created, the most amazing urban landscapes or agricultural civilizations, or just done something amazing in their own world.
Love
that there's this beautiful piece of glass blown in the 5th century BC in Greece that someone's found in an archaeological digging. You just look at it and you think that is just an extraordinary piece of material culture.
Yeah.
But the whole world around it that grows out of that, the intangible that comes or accompanies the tangible, is just like that's the human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that to me is like, wow.
Yeah, it's good.
Agreed. Love that.
Yeah, so the next big thing.
That's right. I'll hold the book in my hand.
That's loaded, isn't
around.
it? Yeah, that's loaded, isn't it?
It is loaded. And, I often, when I'm asked to do something with my poetry, I often read that poem, but I've chosen not to read it today. I think, there are other ones. So because of the context that we're doing this podcast in, I thought to actually focus on something that reflects my dance between theory and practice and being. I think those three things are there because to me they work. And I've spent a lot of time writing about it, obviously more academically, but I think that some of these poems sum up very pithily aspects of my academic interests.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I'll read this one.
That's right.
My Voice, which you picked, And I think it's a great one because it really does kick the ball off. So here we go. My Voice. Theory and distance dwell amongst the thrownness of it all. Embodied scholarship and personal resistance work this space, the churning chaosmos. My body wears it all. Poesis and poetry, declarative in nature, demand a response. We shall rise up, she declares, and I respond again and again. This is a body wisdom calling. My heart throws itself against my ribs, mixing eros and critique, blood and light. And what is this path? A challenge to conditioning, a doing differently, a patterning of new lacuna, a dancing of community back into the flatlands. My voice sings my body's ability to act as an intimate conduit of transformation. My voice and I, we, us, them, it harmonic. A singing bowl for the chaosmos and the skin that seals us all in. That is until we realise our perfect connection to a grace of greater things.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful.
Thing, yeah.
So, I'm saying so much there.
And so much.
I could footnote. With this book, I actually do footnote occasionally because I draw on all sorts of stuff. But that the second line there, amongst the thrownness of it all, Heidegger.
Heidegger. That's what I was going to say.
Dasein.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. So you've got, and it just pops out. I don't sort of sit down and think I'm going to write a philosophical poem.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting there, and suddenly the hand of the muse lands on my shoulder, and I go, oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, and off I go, and
Yeah.
it just sort of flows out.
Nice.
But so it's, to me, I read about poetic practice or praxis, and I'm nearly always touched by an inspiration when I write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it comes quickly, as opposed to the craft.
Right.
And maybe it's because I've spent, so many decades developing my written craft anyway.
That's right.
That it's not that sweat and hard work stuff that it might have been when I was 20 or 30.
Yeah.
That
Well, it's
is
interesting.
one.
You mentioned in the poem the word poesis, which
that's
is
right.
to make,
Yeah.
to bring into being.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter how quickly or how long it takes.
Yeah.
Poesis is that act of making.
Absolutely. And so poesis and poetry, declarative in nature, to me that's what we are sort of, again, that thrownness. We're thrown into this world.
Yeah.
And we spend a lifetime trying to fathom aspects of it, trying to understand elements of the usness, the beingness. But to me, it's also that community stuff, I, we, us, them, it.
Yeah.
That there's this whole rich milieu in which we emerge as consciousness, and which, of course, consciousness is just constantly flowing.
And your voice has more power than just of the self, right? because it captures that community and its purpose.
Because it's not my voice.
It's not your voice.
So my voice. But what is it really? It's not my
It's
voice.
not
You
your
could
voice.
actually say, he's playing a trick with us.
Yeah.
You know.
But I think that's the craft of curating, right? It's like you're really thinking about how much life you can give to something, making it more meaningful, so it touches other people in different ways, right? Your voice, but yet much bigger than that.
Yeah.
And it was my voice first, and then I think the body acts.
Yeah.
I think you had in there as well. So
Yes,
it's kind of like first you have to see and talk about and move forward towards, and then then you take those steps.
Exactly, and also, and those steps are something that obviously forces me to engage or invites me to engage. And I think that both with force, there's coercion and there's invitation, always at play. But I'm thinking about you with your Greekness, your love of Greek tragedy and so on. Theory, which is the first word, is distance.
That's right.
Okay, so there's if we
you have to stand back.
We can actually see Aristotle, his poetics flowing through this.
Definitely.
So was it deliberate? Did you set about to not deliberate at all?
I mean, the word theory and distance. This poem came out of me teaching some theory course.
Okay.
And I was, way I was introducing it to the students, I think they were third year students or something.
Yeah.
Was okay. So what does theory do?
Yeah.
And so it acts as a lens and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And I was probably driving home or sitting around somewhere. And suddenly it sort of went theory and distance, and then it's about me.
Yeah.
We talk about objectivity or being scholarly or academic as having distance, but really it's so personal.
It is.
Because you're making choices.
Escape from that personal nature.
That's right. We are the drivers of the action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the lens you use is yours, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what is reason? What is rationality?
Yeah.
Well, it's just a set of rules that, make sense within one context.
Within context.
But we also, it's deeply an emotional thing. Yeah. Rationality is an emotive. We often don't recognise that. Truth is an emotion. That's why it's so hard to have conversations with people who have different truth positions.
Yeah. So when you write, do you? So I often think about the audience. Like I often think about what I want them to feel or how I want them to emotively connect with what I'm writing. Is it part of your process, or is it more an internal process of this is what I need to get out?
Yeah, I think it's the internal, but I'm always. I mean, you're right to communicate. Yeah. So there's always. Yeah. Am I just writing for myself to communicate and nail something for myself? Well, sometimes that's probably true.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But also, as if we say, well, I'm a poet, you're actually declaring something quite significant. You're saying, okay, I'm writing to share something that has core importance to me. In some way. I want to share and invite you to engage with these things. So somebody who doesn't know Aristotle could read that at one level and get something out of it.
That's right.
So I'm trying to, I write in layers, which is exactly my pedagogy too.
Yeah.
I'm talking about something like some funny historical event because some young people in the room, that's all they know about history is that, and this is an interesting new thing, like that glass bottle from 500 BC or something. You give them something like that, but then you start talking about the culture and the soft stuff around it. So then you're layering in. Somebody else picks up on that who's had, some other experience.
But it's also a teaser for them to go and I want to explore more, right? So I might not know a lot about Aristotle, but when I read that and I connect with it, I go, oh, now I'm interested, right? So I often find it's a teaser for bigger things.
And well, that's the greater things there, the bigger things, the greater things. And of course, to me, a poem should have, or does have a declarative and a didactic dimension, just like the poem you read the other day in your first thing from Alice Walker. It's very much a didactic poem at one level. And for the readers, what was that poem called again? So for the listeners right now. Do we know? Can we point them at it? No. All right.
Which one did we do?
I'm thinking back. I remember the lines in it.
Say a line, I'll remember.
To love what is plentiful, not just what is scarce.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad it's not just me.
No.
That's very cool. But anyway, so for me, this poem is didactic.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but it's more than that. It's more about come and dance with me, come and play, and feel the pleasure of words for themselves. There's a sensuality to words and language, of course, and then mixing eros with critique and blood and light. That's the line from the poem. So we've got all of those things because a poem should have an erotic frisson.
It has an appeal.
Yeah, something there, doesn't it? That goes, I really love that. Yeah. Which explains why some people will get off on Shakespeare, whereas other people will get off on Wallace Stevens, or whatever it is. Yeah. Because we have, I guess our sensory experiences are also attuned in different ways to different kinds of language, different sorts of imagery. There's a scent to poetry.
Yeah.
I think, and you can. I really think that we have these cultural senses too.
Yeah.
So our primary one, of course, is memory.
Yeah.
And to me, I do a whole thing on aesthetics, anticipatory aesthetics, which is something that I've been theorising for nearly a decade now. And to me, memory is really key to how we perceive, to what we are drawn to, repelled by, what's visible and legible and what is illegible. But maybe the illegible is that's last lines. There are grace of greater things. That there's something there that
puts you in. Yeah.
That wind, that comes through.
And there's always the unattainable before it becomes attainable.
Yeah.
There's always those voices that come in and they're just before their time. And then later we look back and we go, oh my gosh. Like Langston Hughes, like we look at who they are and how and what they were actually looking at.
Yeah.
And now from distance we can go, they were spot on.
Yeah. Exactly.
But also to say so much with so little, right? That's the art for me. It's like to say so much with so little, the least number of words to really tell you the story, right? To paint that picture, to introduce you to something. That is, that's the next big thing for me. It's like, how do you, and we compete in a world now with limited attention span, right? So this should be like the time that poetry just takes over, because it doesn't take a lot for someone to engage in poetry and to get so much more out of it.
It's very true. Actually, I touch on that in this other book here, Beyond Alienation, which is a book that I co-edited. And when we started work on the introduction, I did the first draft, and I went to the poets' pharmacy. There's a kind of movement in England, where it was being noticed from probably about 10 years ago, 2013-14, that the sale of poetry books was going up. As we got closer to Brexit and everything, and people were getting really depressed and everything. That people were actually engaging with poetry much more, and that's because I think as we get battered, you would have to say, by the kinds of negative forces of the media as much as anything, that people start looking for solace. And that solace is coming often from things like poetry. Homebread baking, these sorts of things. They sort of got a lot of hype over COVID, but it was happening before that. People are going back to simpler things. And poetry, incredibly complex, incredibly subtle, but it's also, you can grab it in your hand and you can walk with it.
It's attainable.
You can walk with it over a day or two or a week.
It's attainable. And I found that. So if I look at where poetry's been placed in my life, the philosophical movements around the things that have happened through history they converge, right? And it was an easy way for me to understand that. These are the things that, the big questions that I had in my head, but this was like the really the fast track to understanding it, right? And that's how I came to love poetry, is that I was introduced to the Alice Walkers and the Langston Hughes as a child, who told these powerful stories, but even as a kid, I got it. I didn't have to go read a history book. I got it,
And war poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
But during the World War II, the poems that came out during that time, you get a huge sense of that kind of mentality of the unknown and the uncertainty.
When you say that, one of my favorite poems is "Do not weep, maidens, for war is kind." Right? It's like, I wish I could introduce people to all the things. Or I'm a big Ogden Nash fan as well. And people will remember what the things that he's written, but they don't give him credit for the gravity of what he's actually doing. So I love the fact of this, the philosophical take, but as you say, theory is a lens from which we see things and how. But it's personal, right?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, there's a deep spiritual quality to poetry that you can't deny.
No.
And because if it touches your soul, then there's been an electric connection.
Oh yeah,
just like that, zing.
220 volts.
Yeah, absolutely. Just bang, And sometimes even just a line will just transport you somewhere else.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you commented on that with the Alice Walker poem.
Yeah.
That there are these lines that come out and they stick to you. In ways, and they'll pop up at different times.
And they're quotable, right? So I quote that many times. We should learn to love what's abundant, not just what's scarce, because it tells me that as a construct in a society, we're always looking to deny people by only valuing the things that are unattainable, right? The least accessible by the many. And what she's saying, the sand, lots of it.
Absolutely.
Why don't we give it value?
And to me, that applies to so much of our world.
Yeah.
We can walk around being worried about invasive species.
Yeah.
But sometimes you look at an invasive species like, I don't know, a camphor laurel, and you go, oh, that is just an extraordinary creature. And, and you've got to love it for what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we take that as it's almost like a toxin that we have within us, that we want to value stuff because it's the only one of its kind. Or whatever it might. And of course that applies to poetry. What's good poetry as opposed to bad poetry?
Yeah.
So many people say, I can't write poetry, or I can't read poetry.
Yeah.
But it's because in third grade they were slapped about and made fun of, or whatever. There are these little things in our past that deny us from so much of our soul work.
Yeah.
It's true.
And it does matter if it's whether or not it's internal or external, right? I never write poetry to please other people. I always write it for me, but then I think about how it's going to be read or understood by someone else. But so it's where you are, and I think if we learn first to do it from the self and then communicate it with others, then it's a totally different path.
Yes, that's very true. But being aware that I sort of grew up in this kind of tradition where poetry often contained secret knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's me being affected by Robert Graves and his White Goddess sort of stuff. I don't know if you know that book, but it's, everything has a secret, a double meaning to
double
it,
meaning.
Layered, it's so layered.
Yeah, and it's so layered. And, of course, some of his was just pure, fantasy. But at the same time, some of it was rather, to me, it was exciting. And so for me, poetry, therefore, invite you to just it's like archaeology. It's just like keep digging down what's there. And, you go back next week and you read the poem and you'll see it totally differently. Which of course is almost a truism. But, it's still worth saying. Is that I read my poetry and it's like I'm reading somebody else's poetry half the time. I look at it and I think, oh, that's really interesting. Where was I then? I have to go back and I can remember I wrote this poem after a theory class, and I was thinking and feeling, because I don't teach just as a thinker. I teach as a feeler, I'm an embodied teacher.
Yeah. What's funny, we were just talking about a poem, and I said I know where I was when I wrote that. So it's good to know that I'm not the only one doing that.
Yeah.
You know, that captures the mindset I had on that day, or the voice in my head that says this is the line, and you don't know what. So it sounds like a lot of your process happens like that. You observe something in your world,
exactly.
and you need to make it.
You need to make sense of it.
And make it important and make it last, right? Yeah. So then you have to put yourself in this process of what do I do next?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's that positioning of you in a life world that's real.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you know, we look back on Shakespeare or Chaucer or anybody from, you know, that distant past, but they were living and breathing when they wrote that poem.
Yeah.
They were feeling things, they were responding to things, there were longings and, you know, senses of you know, maybe desperate for income. You know, I mean, Shakespeare was writing, you know, for pay, you know, almost by the word.
That's right. The good old days. Now.
But I mean, it's so. I mean, and Dickens was doing that for sure. And although you know, from the 19th century, often that's why Dickens is so wordy. You know, because he has to fill in more words so I get paid more. But you know, but everybody who's written anything ever, they were living and breathing. We forget that also when we're reading philosophers or historians or literary theorists,
and that they were responding to stimuli that they saw within their society.
Yeah, and it was a profession, right?
Yeah, but it's a living profession, and that's really the important part. Is that we cannot ever separate the words from a historical moment or a biographical moment or whatever it is.
The context.
That is probably why when you read a poem, it comes alive.
Yeah.
Because of that life behind it.
Yeah.
It's like a message in a bottle.
Yeah.
You know, just toss it out and who knows where it'll go.
Who knows?
Yeah. So are you inspired by philosophy? Because I hear the philosophical undertones are throughout, right? So is that an inspiration for you?
Yeah, it is, because philosophers have a neat way of touching on things that are often, you could say, disowned.
Yeah.
I think in a way that there's, you know, we want to just keep living our life and don't disturb my worldview. But philosophers' job is to come along, and historians too, many of these professions, literary theorists, you know, to come along and actually say, hey, but, or what about?
Yeah.
So we got this lovely term, chaosmos, which comes from Deleuze and Guattari, you know, and I play with that word all the time because it's so much, we want order, but then there's disorder.
Yeah.
So how do we bring that into, let's say, onto a page?
Yeah.
I mean, a page is very ordered. We've got black squiggly things on a white page. And that's generally what a poem appears like, right?
Yeah.
But then if we start thinking about it, that's when all that soft, murky stuff and the context and the biology of the person who was writing it, you know, all that other stuff is there.
Yeah.
And that's what makes poetry live, which is what you said, Ginna, just before, really. It's that sort of thing. So philosophy, definitely. Not philosophy for its own sake, but philosophy because it's a signpost in the quest for human understanding of what does it mean to be me or us, or, you know, this planet. We're on this planet. So Bruno Latour's stuff or any of that kind of Gaian stuff that comes from ecofeminism or wherever, you know, it's awesome.
Yeah,
I just go wave my arms around and stuff, you know, and, you know, I would love to be able to spend a lot more time playing with that stuff because we live in a very constrained world. We're all at this university, but, you know, the teaching is so narrow, you know, the parameters we get to play in.
How do we change that, though? Because if the next big thing, I always go back to what do we need to do to change it? Because we know the value of it, right? Yeah. There's no questioning that there's value to the introducing people and engaging with in this form. So how do we change that? How do we make the time to change
that's
that?
Such an interesting question. For me, there's a couple of things there that come up. Firstly, you and I teach, Ginna. Do you teach?
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. So we teach, and I think our job is to be subversive.
Yeah.
Very much sowing these ideas all the time in any way for people to pick up on. So in our own little bubble, we can be subversive and sowing seeds for the next big thing.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I think timing is really interesting, and looking at the way timing plays out, we're going through a really narrow point in Western civilizational history at the moment. It's neoliberal, it's totally utilitarian. We're being told this is education, but actually it's conditioning, and we mix the words up now. So will that ever be forever? No, it won't. And I think human beings are naturally subversive.
Yeah.
You get so many different people coming back. So we got a lot of young students, but there are also those middle-aged students or even later in life students who've returned and want to do poetry, or they want to do something totally non-utilitarian.
Yeah.
And I think those people, are examples of the kind of human beings at work that are really changing the world all the time. The world is not just this given stuff that around us. I think it's constantly alive to renegotiation, reinvention,
and evolves to something else, right?
Absolutely.
So how do we do that? I almost think that we need the platform in the middle of the square, and we need an opportunity for people to come together.
Isn't it? This podcast.
You should have it in the open air.
Every little bit. There are some awesome podcasts out there. The On Being podcast from Krista Tippett and people like that. And I'm just constantly going around being, inspired by the kind of work that people are doing to create other spaces for culture to emerge and other spaces for human beings to do their human beings thing. And the number of the rise of indigenous philosophy now is just so heartening. But also the kind of subversion that's coming out of the sciences, the hard sciences. I'm running a session on death futures in September.
Oh, wow.
I've been doing quite a few of these, and they're really starting to rock. I love them. Looking at death technology and the kind of cultures that might emerge around new technologies, because technology spawns culture. Okay, end of lesson. But the point is that in that, I'm working with Monica Gagliano, who's actually has some relationship with UniSC. But she's a professor with a marine biology background who 10, 15, 20 years ago started having these incredible insights with plants. And it's almost shamanic. And then she went off to Ecuador and went on shamanic stuff. But she's woven that into her incredibly thorough, well-theorized kind of re-evaluation of are plants sentient?
Yeah.
Of course they're sentient. I go and talk to my cabbage all the time, or whatever it might be. But this is important stuff, because to me that's an invitation constantly to reconfigure. And a lot of our fellow academics don't get it, or they are so wedded to a discipline. It's really, to me, that transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary stuff is so important.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is that we need to be more transdisciplinary, right? Because we're all connected.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And one of the things you mentioned earlier about this is this idea of yearning.
Yeah.
And you look around and you think, is our society yearning? Yeah. What are they yearning for? Yeah, it's hard.
That yearning is, what are we yearning for?
Because I think it's more passive right now.
Or is it asleep?
I don't know.
Because when I talk to people on an individual level, I get something different than what I observe, right? So what I observe would say there's a sense of apathy, but what I engage with on a day-to-day are people who want change, who want something more positive, but maybe just stuck to a certain
maybe
degree.
not seeing a path
seeing a path, or believing that there's no voice. They've lost their voice, and they've lost their voice in the greater voice. And so they're lost or asleep or something. And that's what I said. What can we do? How do we give that call out to the community to say it's okay, and there's enough of us around, right? And if we work together, right?
Yeah. To me, that call out is ongoing.
Yeah.
There are people all over the place making that call in different ways. And yet we need, and this is again timing. I think timing is so interesting. We forget about the temporal dimension that we inhabit. That temporality is not just linear, it's folded and shifting all the time. And for me then, what happens is things come along that galvanize consciousness. That suddenly you realize that you're not alone, that there's all this other stuff going on. Sometimes it can be, I'm not alone because I'm with the forest. It's not just us as human beings being a species doing species stuff.
It's a planet.
And it's a planet, or it's the cosmos, you know. And that, again, that gets down to that kind of spiritual worldview, which is just relational. We are embedded in relationships. Often relationships that we cannot even begin to appreciate, you know, intellectually. You know, I rabbit on about this stuff in classes, and, you know, how this happens, and I can tell stories. Narrative is really there. But even so, there's this other stuff that just escapes whatever it is that we're yearning for. How do we yearn? Well, if you're a materialist, you would yearn for more cars or more houses or more money. But, you know, if you're a cultural person, you might just collect books. Or you might do something quite different, like all these, there are a lot of nerds around where I live who seem to be collecting old cars, you know, from the 50s and 60s, these old, you know, Holden cars and so on, and doing them up. And it's incredible work of love.
It is.
But it's something that they're doing with their hands that they can do, that takes them to a time when they obviously felt, you know, larger than life. They were youthful and, you know, 20 or 30-year-old guys driving around in 8-cylinder things, you know, and you know, that's also really important to me, because how we express our yearning is going to be totally unique. Again, like you said earlier on, it's contextual. But, you know, the thing is that ultimately we're yearning to go beyond the horizon. I think there's this horizon consciousness that we have that we don't even know we have, but it's biological, it's genetic. It's why human beings moved across the planet so quickly over a few thousand years. But we spread out of Africa and we went around the planet. What was driving people? Or, you know, if you're an environmentalist, you could say, well, there's only a certain amount of energy you can draw from that piece of land, so the tribe, every time it got to a certain level, had to split. That's true. But if you look at what was going on inside in the consciousness of those early human beings, they were painting on walls, they were doing all sorts of stuff that shows that there was this other
yearning,
other dimension. And that, you know, that's that smell that, you know, you go, oh. And of course yearning goes with foresight. It goes with how do we foresee and how do we anticipate, and not just that, how do we strategize so that we can achieve something a little bit more for me, my family, my community, my planet, whatever it might, whatever your parameter of consciousness is.
We can achieve the next big thing. That's awesome.
That's
so good.
That sounds like you're drawing things to a close.
Now, before we close, I'd like your last differentiation. I'd like if you read that and we'll close on.
Okay, sure.
Differentiation that would be great.
Here we go. This one's a nice short one. Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about differentiation. We're talking about the vagaries of categories. You know, what does it mean to be man or woman, or you know, sentient, non-sentient, plant or animal, or whatever. So that's what this is about. Differentiation. Differentiation of a kind, perhaps the woman made man, the man made woman, and one once made is bereft. A cut across the space of being, mapped by him, moulded by her. The symbols we know, chalice and blade, and from the shadow the other is made.
Love
chalice
it.
And blade.
And it just folds in.
Just folds.
It just folds in. The Chalice and Blade, of course, is a title for a book in the 1980s.
Yes.
Rihanna Eisler. It was a major breakthrough, I think, intellectually.
It was.
In looking at the categories that shape and hold us prisoner. So when we're talking about what does it take, we have to recognise that our categories are given usually by somebody else. We're living other people's stories, we're living other people's categories, until we start claiming our own categories, or actually saying,
or no labels, or no labels. I like the no labels.
That's a really interesting idea. to me, the no labels idea because the way we have been conditioned in culture is that there are always labels. Yeah. So how do we shuffle them? How do we dissolve them? What's the solvent?
And
how would we find our belonging?
But the labels makes it easier, but it doesn't necessarily lead to better things, right? So I think it's, if we can accept that it may not be as easy, then no labels make sense. And that's where I've come to in my life. It doesn't have to be the quickest pathway. It's just the one I want to be on, right?
Yeah. Nice.
And so for me, I like to, I don't like labels because it can, I feel like imprisoned, like when the labels are there, it confines me. It tells me what's right and what's wrong and all of those things. And I think it sometimes I'm missing the discovery, right?
Yeah.
And the nuance.
I mean, the nuance or the context. Yeah. So I'm actually on this no labels thing at the moment, and that don't put a label on it. Let me figure it out for myself, and you can still have your opinion of it, but let me figure it out for myself. Yeah. And that's kind of the way I've lived my life.
Well, to me, that's the object of, let's say, critical theory.
Yeah.
Is the dissolution of a label, which holds us prisoner. I mean, Foucault puts it beautifully, it's about being governed a little less. By whatever's the context. But he never says it's not being governed in absolute sense. Because that's kind of like, then let's go back to being an amoeba or something. But even an amoeba's governed
that's
by
too frightful for people
laws or whatever. At the same time, that striving for freedom, which is a yearning, that constant striving for freedom to realise a little more within this little space that is my own little consciousness, plural consciousnesses, because I'm not an individual, I'm a collective. Something.
Well, it's a lovely cushion to end the day and the conversation.
I think we could sit and talk all afternoon.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there's just so many there's so many idiosyncrasies and variances that we can explore. And that's what I love about it. And you're right, it is a yearning, it's a curiosity. It and
absolutely.
it is just it's a decision, really, to get into poetry. So we thank all of you who are listening for making the decision to join us. We thank you, Dr. Marcus.
Thank you too.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. TB, it's always a pleasure.
And I encourage everyone, the next big thing, right?
Absolutely.
Go get the book.
Go and get the book.
Go get the book. The next big thing. Yeah. Wonderful. All right, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Adios, amigos.